Imagine waking up in the middle of the night to the savory scent of frying bacon wafting through the halls of your home. Most people would assume a family member had developed a sudden late-night appetite, or perhaps a guest was making themselves comfortable in the kitchen. But for one wealthy family in the bustling heart of London, during the early 20th century, the reality was far more unsettling. They descended the stairs to find a stranger standing at their stove, calmly flipping rashers of bacon in a cast iron skillet. He was not wearing a mask or brandishing a weapon, but rather he was wearing one of their own silk aprons. This was not a simple case of a hungry vagrant stumbling in from the cold. This was the work of a man who would soon baffle Scotland Yard and become a legend in the annals of strange crime. He was a burglar who treated every crime scene not as a target, but as a bed and breakfast. The year was 1924, and London was alive with the frenetic energy of the Roaring Twenties. Jazz clubs were booming, and the wealthy elite were displaying their opulence with reckless abandon. However, beneath the glitter and the glamour, a peculiar shadow was moving through the high society neighborhoods of Mayfair and Kensington. The police had received sporadic reports of break-ins where nothing of significant value seemed to be missing. Instead, the homeowners reported strange anomalies that defied the logic of traditional theft. A bottle of expensive wine would be uncorked and half consumed. A wheel of cheese would have a precise wedge cut from it. In one instance, a roast chicken was stripped clean to the bone and left neatly on a china plate in the center of the dining table. The press began to whisper about a thief with an appetite, but the police were hesitant to dedicate resources to what seemed like a prankster. Inspector Thomas Miller of Scotland Yard was a man known for his serious demeanor and his intolerance for nonsense. He was accustomed to chasing violent gangsters and cracking safe-blowing rings. When the file for the so-called Gastronomic Bandit landed on his desk, he scoffed at the absurdity of it. Miller was a veteran of the Great War and had seen the darkest sides of human nature. The idea of hunting down a man who broke into mansions merely to cook a meal felt beneath him. However, as the reports began to pile up, Miller noticed a disturbing pattern. The burglar was not just eating leftovers. He was staying for hours. He was making himself at home, while the homeowners slept upstairs unaware of the intruder in their midst. The sheer audacity of the crimes suggested a psychological profile that was far more complex than a simple hungry thief. The breakthrough that changed the tone of the investigation occurred on a foggy Tuesday morning in November. A prominent banker named Arthur Sterling returned home early from a business trip to find his kitchen in a state of chaotic culinary activity. The back door had been picked with professional precision. On the counter sat a freshly baked apple pie still steaming from the oven. The intruder had used the Sterling's flour butter and apples to construct a dessert from scratch. But the most chilling detail was not the pie itself. It was the note left beside it, written on the back of a napkin in elegant cursive script. It read simply, "My compliments to the grocer. The apples were divine." This was no desperate vagrant. This was a man mocking the sanctity of the private home. He was asserting dominance not through violence, but through domestic comfort. Inspector Miller arrived at the Sterling residence within the hour. He surveyed the kitchen, which smelled deceptively welcoming. The contrast between the warm scent of cinnamon and the violation of the law was jarring. Miller realized that they were dealing with a narcissist who derived pleasure from the intimacy of the act. The burglar was inserting himself into the lives of his victims in the most personal way possible. He was consuming their food using their utensils and sitting at their tables. Miller ordered his men to dust the kitchen for fingerprints, a relatively new science that was becoming a standard tool in the detective arsenal. They found prints on the rolling pin and the handle of the oven door. The prints were distinct and clear, suggesting the thief had not bothered to wear gloves while he cooked. The fingerprints were cross-referenced with the criminal records at Scotland Yard, but they yielded no match. This suggested that the burglar was either a first-time offender or a ghost who had managed to evade the law for his entire life. Miller decided to change his strategy. He needed to understand the mind of the man he was hunting. He consulted with a psychiatrist named Dr. Julian Thorne, who specialized in the criminal mind. Thorne suggested that the burglar was likely a man who felt excluded from society. By breaking into these homes and cooking meals, he was role-playing a life he could not have. He was pretending to be the master of the house for a few fleeting hours. The cooking was a ritual of ownership. Eating the food was a way of internalizing the wealth and status of his victims. Armed with this profile, Inspector Miller increased patrols in the affluent districts. He instructed his constables to look for men who seemed out of place, not because they looked like thugs, but because they looked like they were longing for something. Weeks passed without an arrest, and the press began to mock the police force. Headlines ridiculed the Yard for failing to catch a man whose primary weapon was a spatula. The public found the story amusing, imagining a gentleman thief frying eggs in a tuxedo. But for the families who woke up to find their kitchens used and their privacy violated, the situation was terrifying. The thought of a stranger silently chopping vegetables downstairs while they slept was the stuff of nightmares. Then came the night of December the 12th. A heavy snow was falling over London, blanketing the cobblestones in white. In a 3-story townhouse near Hyde Park, a young maid named Clara was waking up early to start the coal fires. As she descended into the kitchen, she heard the distinct clatter of pans. Assuming the cook had arrived early, she pushed open the door and froze. Standing at the stove was a man she had never seen before. He was tall and slender, wearing a dark suit that had seen better days. He was humming a soft tune as he stirred a pot of oatmeal. Clara screamed, dropping her coal scuttle with a deafening crash. The man did not run. He simply turned to her, smiled politely, and tipped an imaginary hat before vaulting out the window into the snowy garden. Clara provided the first detailed description of the intruder. She described him as a man in his late 30s with a gaunt face and sad eyes. He looked like a fallen aristocrat, someone who had known better days and was trying to reclaim a lost dignity. This description matched the profile Dr. Thorne had created. The man was not a career criminal in the traditional sense. He was a tragic figure acting out a fantasy. Miller circulated the description to every beat cop in London. The net was tightening. The snow that had aided the burglar's escape also proved to be his undoing. The fresh powder in the garden preserved a perfect set of footprints leading away from the house and toward the main road. The footprints revealed a distinctive wear pattern on the heel of the right shoe. It was a small detail, but in the world of forensic science, it was a golden thread. Miller ordered his men to check the local cobblers and shoe repair shops in the surrounding districts. It was a tedious task involving long hours of questioning and showing sketches. But detective work was rarely about exciting chases. It was about the slow, methodical accumulation of facts. 3 days later, a cobbler in Chelsea recognized the description of the shoe wear. He told the police that a man fitting the description of the burglar had brought in a pair of boots with that exact defect just the week before. The man had given his name as Arthur Pennyworth. Arthur Pennyworth was a name that did not exist in the criminal database, but a search of civil records revealed a tragic history. Pennyworth had once been a sous chef at a prestigious hotel in the city. He had been a man of talent and promise until the war broke out. He returned from the trenches with shattered nerves and a trembling hand that ended his culinary career. He lost his job, his home, and his standing in society. He drifted into obscurity, becoming one of the many forgotten men of the post-war era. The revelation brought a wave of sympathy to Inspector Miller, but the law was the law. Pennyworth was breaking into homes and terrorizing families. He had to be stopped. Police located Pennyworth's current residence, a small dilapidated room in a boarding house in the East End. It was a stark contrast to the opulent homes he had been visiting. Miller organized a raid for the early hours of the morning, hoping to catch Pennyworth while he slept. A team of 6 officers surrounded the building. Miller kicked open the door to the small room, expecting a confrontation. Instead, they found the room empty. But on the small wooden table in the center of the room, there was a clue. It was a menu. A handwritten menu detailing a 3-course meal. It was not a record of a past meal, but a plan for a future one. The date on the menu was for that very night. The location listed on the menu was the residence of Lord Harrington, a massive estate on the edge of the city. Miller realized that Pennyworth was planning his grand finale. He rushed his team to the Harrington estate, sirens wailing through the empty streets. They arrived to find the house dark and silent. Miller signaled for his men to surround the perimeter, while he and a sergeant approached the kitchen entrance. The door was unlocked. Miller drew his revolver and pushed the door open. The kitchen was illuminated by a single candle. In the center of the room stood Arthur Pennyworth. He was not cooking. He was sitting at the table, eating a plate of roast beef with a glass of red wine. Pennyworth looked up as the police entered. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not try to run. He simply wiped his mouth with a napkin and stood up. "Good evening, Inspector," he said with a calm voice. "I have been expecting you." The resignation in his voice was palpable. He was tired of running. He was tired of pretending. Miller holstered his weapon and approached the man. There was no malice in Pennyworth's eyes, only a deep and profound loneliness. He allowed the officers to handcuff him without resistance. As they led him away, he looked back at the kitchen one last time. It was a look of longing for a life that he could never truly possess. The trial of Arthur Pennyworth became a media sensation. The public was captivated by the story of the war hero turned burglar chef. The newspapers dubbed him the Midnight Gourmet. During his testimony, Pennyworth spoke eloquently about his motivations. He explained that he did not steal for money. He stole for the feeling of home. He missed the warmth of a kitchen, the smell of cooking food, and the sense of order that a meal provided. He described the cold and the hunger of the streets, and how for a few hours in those wealthy homes he felt human again. The courtroom was moved to silence by his words. Even the prosecutor seemed reluctant to press for a harsh sentence. Despite the public sympathy, the law required justice. Pennyworth had broken into dozens of homes and violated the sanctity of private property. The judge acknowledged Pennyworth's tragic circumstances, but sentenced him to 3 years in prison. It was a lenient sentence by the standards of the time, but it meant that the Midnight Gourmet would be behind bars. As Pennyworth was led out of the courtroom, he was cheered by a crowd of supporters. He had become a folk hero, a symbol of the forgotten men who were struggling to find their place in a changing world. Inspector Miller watched him go with a mixture of relief and sadness. He had caught his man, but he felt no triumph. Prison life was hard for a man of Pennyworth's temperament. He was surrounded by hardened criminals who did not understand his refined sensibilities. However, his culinary skills soon found a new outlet. The prison warden, learning of Pennyworth's background, assigned him to the prison kitchen. It was a far cry from the high-end hotels or the mansions of Mayfair, but it was a kitchen nonetheless. Pennyworth threw himself into his work. He transformed the bland prison rations into meals that were actually edible. He taught the other inmates how to bake bread and how to season a stew. In the unlikeliest of places, he found a sense of purpose. News of the improved food at the prison began to spread. The morale of the inmates improved, and violence within the prison walls decreased. The warden credited Pennyworth with the change. The midnight gourmet had not only found a way to survive his sentence, but he was using his talents to improve the lives of those around him. He became a respected figure within the prison hierarchy. He was no longer the outcast or the intruder. He was the head chef. For the first time since the war, Pennyworth felt a sense of belonging that was real and not stolen. Upon his release, 3 years later, Arthur Pennyworth was a changed man. He emerged from the prison gates with a graying beard and a new resolve. He did not return to the boarding house in the East End. Instead, he used the small amount of money he had earned in prison to open a small food stall in a busy market. He sold simple hearty meals, stews, soups, and fresh bread. He called his stall the Open Door. It was a humble beginning, but it was his own. He was no longer cooking in the shadows of other people's homes. He was cooking in the light of day for customers who paid him with smiles and gratitude. Inspector Miller, now retired, visited the stall one afternoon. He ordered a bowl of stew and sat on a wooden crate to eat it. It was delicious. He looked at Pennyworth, who was busy kneading dough, and saw a man who had finally found peace. They exchanged a nod of mutual respect. The chase was over. The mystery was solved. The burglar who stopped to cook a meal had finally found a kitchen where he didn't have to look over his shoulder. It was a quiet ending to a sensational story, but it was the ending that Arthur Pennyworth deserved. The story of the cooking burglar faded from the headlines, but it remained a favorite anecdote in the legal circles of London. It was a reminder that crime is not always motivated by greed or malice. Sometimes it is motivated by a desperate need for comfort and connection. The case challenged the rigid definitions of criminal behavior. It forced the police and the public to look beyond the act of breaking and entering and to see the human being behind the crime. It was a lesson in empathy that Inspector Miller carried with him for the rest of his life. Years later, during the Blitz of the Second World War, the story of Arthur Pennyworth resurfaced. As Londoners huddled in bomb shelters, sharing meager rations, and trying to keep their spirits up, the legend of the burglar who cooked apple pies in the homes of the rich became a symbol of resilience. It was a story about finding comfort in the darkest of times. It was a story about the universal power of food to bring people together, even if the circumstances were illegal. Pennyworth himself, by then an old man, ran a soup kitchen during the war, feeding the homeless and the displaced. The soup kitchen became a beacon of hope in a shattered city. Pennyworth worked tirelessly, stirring giant pots of soup while bombs fell overhead. He never spoke much about his past as a burglar. He preferred to let his food do the talking. Those who knew his story treated him with a reverence usually reserved for war heroes. In a way, he was a hero. He had fought a personal war against loneliness and despair, and he had won. He had turned his weakness into a strength and his crime into a service. When Arthur Pennyworth finally passed away in the winter of 1952, his funeral was attended by hundreds of people. There were former inmates from the prison, former customers from his market stall, and even a few of the wealthy homeowners whose kitchens he had once invaded. They came to pay their respects to a man who had touched their lives in unexpected ways. The obituary in the London Times simply read Arthur Pennyworth, chef and gentleman. It was a fitting epitaph for a man who had lived such a complex and contradictory life. The legacy of the Midnight Gourmet lives on in the folklore of true crime. It is a story that is often retold with embellishments and variations. Some versions say he cooked lobster thermidor, while others say he simply made toast. But the core of the story remains the same. It is the story of a man who sought warmth in a cold world. It is a reminder that behind every headline and every police report, there is a human story waiting to be told. It challenges us to look closer, to suspend judgment, and to understand the hidden hungers that drive us all. Today, if you walk through the archives of Scotland Yard, you might find the dusty file labeled the Gastronomic Bandit. Inside are the faded police reports, the sketches of footprints, and the handwritten menu found in the boarding house. They are artifacts of a bygone era, a time when crime seemed to have a different character. But they are also evidence of a unique psychological drama. They tell the tale of a burglar who didn't want your money or your jewelry. He just wanted to cook you dinner. The case also serves as a fascinating study in the evolution of forensic science. The use of fingerprints to track Pennyworth was one of the early successes of the technique in a non-violent crime. It demonstrated the power of science to solve mysteries that baffled traditional intuition. The analysis of the shoe wear pattern was another example of the meticulous, detail-oriented work that defines modern detective work. In catching a cooking burglar, the London police honed skills that would later be used to catch murderers and spies. But perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Arthur Pennyworth case is the power of redemption. Pennyworth could have easily become a career criminal, bouncing in and out of prison until he died. Instead, he used his time in prison to rediscover his passion and his self-worth. He proved that a person is not defined by their worst mistake. He showed that it is never too late to rewrite your own recipe for life. His journey from the shadows of a stranger's kitchen to the light of his own soup kitchen is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. As we look back on this historical puzzle, we are left with a lingering question. What would we do if we walked into our kitchen and found a stranger cooking a meal? Would we react with fear and anger, or would we be curious? The story of Arthur Pennyworth suggests that sometimes the intruder is not a monster, but a mirror reflecting our own basic needs for safety, warmth, and sustenance. It invites us to consider the thin line that separates the law-abiding citizen from the desperate outcast. So the next time you smell bacon frying in the middle of the night, do not be too quick to assume it is just a midnight snack. It might be a ghost from the past, a reminder of the burglar who stopped to cook a meal. It is a story that belongs to the midnight hours, to the quiet moments when the world is asleep and anything seems possible. It is a story for the midnight docket, where the strangest files are opened and the truth is always stranger than fiction.